Hi, everyone. We're super excited to welcome everybody to our third webinar on GSV's Learning and Earning Report. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, I highly recommend that you download it. Today, we are building off our last theme about ambient AI and to discuss how it can turn assessment into a continuous stream of data and intelligence on skills, knowledge, and aptitude, be it a classroom debate, a customer service call, or a lab presentation. These experiences, in theory, can directly feed into dynamic profiles of skills and growth. And done right, we're hoping that this shift could measure real learning and impactful feedback, as opposed to some of the historical proxies that people have relied on. But done wrong, it risks turning schools and workplaces into surveillance states. So today I'm joined by my co-host and partner / AI lead at GSV, Claire Zau, and two amazing panelists. The first panelist is Patty West-Smith, who is the Senior Director of Customer Engagement at Turnitin, has worked in every capacity within a school district and on local, state, national curriculum assessment development projects. We also have Jon Laven, who is co-founder and COO of Snorkl, and a longtime former teacher. He started Snorkl as to be used as a formative assessment, but really it enables teachers to understand students' reasoning and thinking through various multimodal AI inputs. Before we kick off, I just want to call out that we have a comment section in the bottom, and we'll leave about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So please do contribute your questions and thoughts into the conversation. And with that, welcome everybody.
Hi. Great to be here.
Awesome. So why don't we just start off and carry over from some of our previous conversation, which is for ambient AI, there's an opportunity to collect a whole bunch of various different inputs and signals. And I'd love to see for you both, what are kind of the most exciting new data sources, be it audio, visual, biometrics, telemetry, that you think will help reshape assessments in both school and the workplace?
Do you want to jump in, John, or you want me to go first?
Go for it, Patty.
For me, there are two parts of it that I think are the most exciting. One, I think the concept of wearables has just an incredible amount of potential. I don't know for sure where it will go, but I think it can go in so many different directions that it offers a lot of possibility. And I find that really exciting because I think it's really introducing an element to the learning environment that we haven't necessarily had or haven't had a way to capture, particularly at scale, right? So I think that's really exciting. My first thought around that is around educators and the feedback for them as opposed to students. I think that probably needs a little bit more exploration, particularly around protections and what is age appropriate and what is not. But I do find that really exciting. But I actually think the most exciting thing for me is bringing all of those data sources together. It's not really one of them that I find most exciting. It's the idea that there's this possibility of running a thread through all of them and forming a much more complete picture than any single source of data can provide anyone. I find that really, really energizing. And I think that's a new element that is coming into education that I think it's going to have a really transformational impact.
Yeah, I think right now what we're really focused on is how we capture students' voice and also visual responses in really rich ways in the classroom. And I think that gives us just a totally different and deeper insight into student thinking than would otherwise be available through more traditional assessment measures, through more traditional tools for students to practice in, and really opens up a ton of possibilities around how do you measure learning, how do you better respond to student learning and address gaps. And so, yeah, I'm excited about sort of the first steps we've taken in that direction and also what comes next for the bigger field and industry.
I guess to quickly follow up on that, since you all are working with this data, I'm so curious to hear, there's so much that you can do with this, right? I think now that AI has unlocked all these different different modalities, audio, video, even just looking at handwritten work we can do at scale now. I'm curious what you feel like are actionable data points versus just distracting, because there's a lot of things that we can track. What do you feel like are priorities to track that will actually be insightful for an educator as opposed to just giving them data on everything?
Good.
Okay. So for me, I think there's data that we've had available to us, but we've never been able to manage really well, right? Like, so obviously Turnitin is very deep in the writing space. And, folks like me who've studied writing pedagogy know that the sort of tenets of what makes tried and true writing effective writing instruction have been established for a very long time, and they haven't shifted a lot, but they've always been really hard to do. I think the potential that is unlocked right now is the ability to do things that we know directly impact student learning in a manageable way so that we can follow those best practices. If you look at a product like Clarity, which we recently brought to market, that allows the educator to see the writing process as the writing evolves. I mean, you can talk to any K-12 ELA instructor and they will tell you that the writing process is an important part of how we teach writing. But capturing data along the way about how that evolves is really, really challenging. You have 35, 40 students in a class, even if you have 15 students in a class, trying to keep track of where each one of them are, what their specific needs are, what intervention you've already applied, what hasn't happened. All of that is it's like the classic spinning plates graphic, right? And so being able to catch each one in the right moment and then intervene, provide the right intervention at the right moment for the right student it really has never been feasible. Teachers have tried to do it for years, but it's so hard. But now we have the technology that allows us to do that. So many of the things that we would have to tease out of a student, how did you go about your research process? How did you look at the credibility of this source? Those are things we would have to question and rely on students to tell us. In many cases, students didn't have the right vocabulary to talk to us about those choices. So there's a lot of what feels like fumbling around in the dark to try to find those pieces, and then making educated guesses. And we have done that to the best of our ability, but it's really tough. But when you can actually see an individual student's works taking shape, see the choices they're making along the way, where they have used AI, where they haven't, how they used it, what they asked, in specific prompts, gives you so much insight. And then in this space of generative AI, what that then allows you to do is let students begin to practice how they use those tools, which is a brand new element to all of us. And I don't know about you, it's been a long time since I was in my undergraduate classes, but we did not have a course in generative AI, I can promise you. And I think the vast majority of educators who are in the classroom today did not have that training. So I think there's what's new, but then there's also this ability to do the things we knew were best practice, but never had the tools to do it. So I think that for me, that's really important, is to focus on what we know to be effective and impactful. And I think that will help folks filter out some of the noise to a great degree.
Yeah, Patty, so many interesting things in there. And I think one of them that resonates also for me is around this watching the process of students, in your case, student writing. In our case, it's often students like thinking and explanations. Snorkl students record and explain how they're thinking about their math problem or how they are interpreting the reading passage or X, Y, Z other thing. But I think what that allows for is like one obvious piece is probably around like you can obviously understand mastery around open-ended questions in a much deeper way, but it also allows us to surface things for teachers, like what strategies are students using, what are the trending misconceptions that are happening in that process, where are the gaps. And I think a third sort of interesting one for us is around language, because students are recording an explanation of their thinking. We can capture a lot of really rich data around what vocabulary and some of those questions around how do we support our language learners in showing and building that academic proficiency. And so it just becomes a much richer picture of what student achievement looks like, and also hopefully supporting really strong instruction to those different things.
Patty, Interesting, you were talking about kind of being able to measure consistently throughout, right? And being able to have those feedback as the students progress and getting those new signals. And it makes me think of kind of like the current historical structure of like you space all these, as multiple times as possible formative assessments, and then having like a summative assessment at the end. And in the workplace, it's kind of like maybe you have monthly check-in calls with your manager, and then you have like your big year-end 360 review. As we be able to collect more robust information and be able to accurately track over time, how do you guys think about that dynamic between formative and summative assessments? Is there still a point to have the summative assessments at the end? Like, love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think there's always going to be a place for both formative and summative assessment. But I do think that what will shift is the weight that is lent to summative assessment today, right? Mm-hmm. In many ways, the education system as a whole treats summative assessment and assessment period as an event, a thing that happens. There's a specific day and time that it's recorded, right? As though that's how learning happens, right? On Tuesday at 8:42, John, I'll be assessing what you've learned. And that's the only moment in time that you can show it to me. No one believes that, right? But the system doesn't give us a lot of flexibility around that. And there will still be those point in time summative assessments that are necessary, so we have that comparability, just to understand where students are in comparison to each other and really assess what's working and what isn't. But what I think that a smarter AI assessment space will lend us to is this idea that assessment is really about movement. It's about driving learning forward and moving it forward. You don't do that with a single event, right? You do that with regular checks along the way to understand what students are doing. And it's not, it's not a single exit ticket. It's every question that you ask a student. It's to John's point, it's how they approach the thinking, right? How do they come to a decision about how they're going to approach this task? That in and of itself is very revealing about what students know and what they need in terms of our support. But again, it's been very difficult to do that. But I think what this will allow us to do is really think about these just continuous set of feedback loops that come together in a much more comprehensive picture. I'm sort of a student of John Hattie's, and we published some research with him a couple years ago, one of my highest accomplishments as an academic, frankly. And he talks a lot about the effect size of feedback, particularly certain types of feedback we know to make a bigger impact on student learning. Where to next is the feedback that his research has shown has the greatest impact on student learning. But the ability to provide that in a sustainable way across every student has always been the biggest challenge. It's not that we don't know what to do, it's how do we do that with the challenges that teachers face, with these crazy prep times and huge caseloads of students and, other administrative tasks that take up so much time. When AI really helps us to look at assessment as these series of feedback loops and empowers us with tools to push out that high quality feedback, we're going to start to supercharge that learning, and we start to really shift the way that we think about assessment entirely. And it's no longer about Tuesday at 8:42. It's about every minute along the way and all of the choices, all of the artifacts that we're taking in. I think what will be really exciting from a ed tech perspective for folks like us who live in that space is, can we build tools that bring all of that together, that start to synthesize those multiple streams of data across a student's experience, across platforms, across learning context. In some ways, it may even go outside of the traditional student day, in ways that we've never had access to that data. So I think it's a very exciting time, but it is a real paradigm shift. And one thing if I were still out there in classrooms and in schools, I would really be seriously thinking about, how do I invest in professional learning to support educators as they're moving through this change, because it will be a huge change. It already is, but it's going to continue at a rapid pace, and educators will need a lot of support through that to manage it.
I guess I'm sorry.
I think that was really well said. I think the only thing I'd add is, as those assessments get more embedded into the instructional cycle, that like the time frame there on the data turnaround just becomes so immediate, right? And so instead of having kids take a test in January and we find out their results in May when it's too late to do anything with that data, like I think just the possibilities of the speed there is also really exciting.
Yeah. I love the way both of you laid it out. I always think of, the health space and how we have precedents in this, right? You have certain goals you're working towards, say running a marathon, but it is helpful to have this kind of news in there. Even if you're not checking it, at least you know on where you are on track to hit that goal. I guess, Patty, you kind of brought this up around this continuous data capture and this opportunity to even extend beyond the classroom. And I think this is something we've been discussing is just how do you, there are so many different ed tech platforms that are doing so much important work, whether that's delivering assessment, delivering the actual curriculum itself. Kids are engaging with other tools in and outside of the classroom. They're doing a lot of learning outside of school. And so I've always been curious to hear how, as people building great learning products and feedback products, 5 to 10 years out, even for this ecosystem, do you see a world where we are even able to consolidate that data? Is it kind of like the healthcare space where the user is collecting that? And I'm curious how you see this playing out for the space.
John, do you want to jump in on that, or you want me to?
I'm happy to chime in. I think that, I think it's interesting to watch how different players in this space right now are positioning themselves around that, because I think some companies are building around the premise that they're going to be the nexus that pulls in all the different data pieces. And our sort of position is that actually we are really centered around capturing a particular data piece, and perhaps there's other avenues for us to expand other data pieces that we collect. And I think both models are really interesting. I think there's a lot of excitement, obviously, around this idea of like instructional coherence, that you could have this clear connection between your student data and your curriculum and how that all feeds together in a system. And it's hard to do and hard to execute, but I think there will be some emerging leaders in that over the next 5 years, over the next longer time frame. And I think there's a lot of really rich possibilities for that when we can get more aware of how student learning is progressing and how we can pull the right levers and support teachers better and support students better to make that growth more meaningful.
Yeah, I sit in the customer experience organization at the company. So my job is to really put myself in the shoes of our users just all the time. How will a customer experience this, or how will a user experience this? And thankfully I have some experience there. So I've been there. But when I put myself in the shoes of the educator in this kind of moment, it immediately feels really big, like really overwhelming, almost like a wave could be crashing down on me. So I have to imagine that is how practitioners in the field really feel in this moment. And as AI kind of grows and expands and becomes more pervasive, unless we really disrupt that, it will start to overwhelm and knock folks out. So I think there are, sort of two big possibilities. One is, we really look to make systems interoperable, right? Like, can John's Snorkl product plug in with Turnitin's Clarity, right? Like, and so from a very technical perspective, can they work together and, push up insights? I think that's one approach, and probably there are people already pursuing that quite hard, right? And then there's this idea that there would be like a specialized set of platforms that don't provide any kind of services, but can pull all of those pieces together, right? And it's been over 9 years since I was in the district, but we use a data warehouse to pull in like static data from state tests and things like that. So that's a concept that's possible, right? That there's like a third party place that we all plug into, right? And schools can then surface that and bring reports, bring profiles. I think there's probably potential value in both. I think both will probably be pursued. But when I really think about how the educator is going to experience that, I hope that the folks who are building those things are really carefully thinking about how little time teachers already have, how some of them are not comfortable with this technology yet, and how easy we need to make it for them for this to be meaningful, right? Because we could all have all the data in the world, but if we don't know how to access it easily, if we don't know how to put the pieces together, if we don't know how to draw the right conclusions, that's going to become a barrier for use. It will be there, the data will be there, but whether it is valuable comes down to whether people can actually use it. So we need to give real thought to what that looks like in the sort of workflow of an educator who's actually out there working with students, and make sure that we're building it in a way that is really responsive to what their experience is and what their needs are. So it's going to need to be closely tied to the people who are in the field, and we have to be constantly getting their feedback to see if the things that we're building are really working for the scenarios they find themselves in.
Yeah, I love that, because I think one of the things that continues to come up as we talk about ambient data is also the safety and privacy conversation, but also generally, I can totally see how this builds an underlying surveillance culture. Is there a world where teachers and students feel like they need to perform for this ambient AI that's always listening? And I wonder, what are the different ways the products that we put out there will make it such that the ways we put them out there is much more insight driven and much more empowering, as opposed to just being kind of this evaluative, punitive system that's always watching. You all have put out products that have elements of collecting a lot of data from the user, but it feels like you all have clicked on something where the people who use it feel value. They don't necessarily see it as a punitive surveillance tool. So I'm curious how you have bridged your product to not be in that territory and then be one that is really much more insight driven and much more empowering.
Yeah, I think the real power and potential, and hopefully if we're doing things right, is we are giving more opportunities to celebrate our students' strengths. We're finding more opportunities to capture their brilliance and show that to their teacher, show that to their parents, building off of our students' brilliance, as opposed to more opportunities to have gotcha moments for students or for teachers. Like that's what we don't want. But obviously, as you've gathered data, both of those things are possible. And so I think one thing that we, like on a very surface level, we focus on, like, how do we make sure students are feeling celebrated whenever we are using AI to give students feedback? That's really important to us, even if you could put in the most basic response and we're going to find something to celebrate. But also not wanting that to sugarcoat or cover up if there are gaps in student understanding. We want to support students to get there. So I think, I was in the classroom for 10 years. And so I come with this from a lens as an educator of, like, we want to be assets-based. We want to we know that a really important part of that education experience is feeling a sense of connection and ownership and pride in your learning. And we can also help more of our students to get there with the right supports in place. And so I'm hoping that's going to be universally true as more and more of these tools are integrated into the classroom.
I would agree with all that, but I would add, I think there's what you build, which obviously, to Jon's point, a lot of the way that you approach that can be thoughtful about celebrating as opposed to surveilling, which is a big deal, but also the value of providing insights to make sure students get what they need. There's an element of equity there that is so important to emphasize. So I think all of those things are important. One of the things we find really powerful when we talk to our customers is they respond so well to this idea of user controls, of understanding what the permissions are, what the roles are, who has access to what data. That's incredibly important. There are ethical and legal bounds around that, but just to the average teacher, understanding how you can use something or choose not to use something. Being able to turn things on and off is important, and understanding what the right context for those different scenarios are. So I think giving users some control helps a lot with the feeling that this is not being used to surveil, it's not being used at a gotcha, it's a tool that I get to use to the intended purpose. That's a lot. And look, as a parent of a 5-year-old, that also matters to me from a student perspective, that there is an educator who has training and works with my child who can apply their expertise to understanding how tools should and should not be used. That's incredibly important to me as a parent and a former educator. And I think that comes into our approach at Turnitin, and just the how of what we approach product development, where we try to live really closely to the users. We're constantly doing user testing and iterating on the way that we build things to, again, ensure that that expertise that comes from a trained educator giving us feedback helps to inform the way that we build our products. We've taken that even a step further in that we have a whole host of people like me who work in roles across the company where we have come from a background in education, and we can apply that pedagogical lens. Jon, you said you taught for 10 years. I'm sure you're bringing that into your work every day, those experiences. I think it lends us credibility as a partner to the people who will use our tools. And that helps to build trust between not just students and teachers, but also teachers and vendors like us who are building technology. And that trust is really critical. But I will also say that there is a lot that comes that is not just the tool in itself, but is what I think of as the wraparound of the tool, right? We do work like building our online community where educators can engage directly with experts at the company, where they can engage with each other to understand how they're using the tools, to what end, what guardrails they've put in place. And I think we also have to be really forward thinking, particularly around policy and structures. We need to think ahead of time. What are our policies going to be about how this data gets used? We need to think about it from an ed tech perspective, but educators and schools and institutions need to be thinking about it and ensuring that they're bringing in a diverse set of stakeholders to have the most comprehensive view of that as possible. Bring in students and educators and parents and people from the workforce, right? They all have a stake in this, and we should be really thoughtfully building policies with that in mind. But you have to think ahead. You can't just bring in the tech and then try to figure out what works and what people are allowed to do. You have to plan that out ahead of time. So I think of all of that, along with the professional learning I've already alluded to, are really critical. Turnitin has just recently launched a partnership with AQ, building out an entire module on effective use of AI in instruction. And the reason we have invested in that is because we know that even aside from the product, is going to be really critical to how this technology lives in schools and in classrooms.
I really appreciate this idea of very tactical, multiple pronged approaches to how you ultimately build trust, right? Which has been like such a reoccurring theme when it comes to anything that deals with AI. One of the areas that I think we haven't dug into there is ensuring and having confidence that the signals that are being drawn out are giving the right assessment, right? Like, how do you think about the evaluation and the framework of the output that all these signals are bringing in so that people are driving the right actions correctly? I'm curious how you guys have thought and worked on that front.
I'll just share two quick thoughts. One is that we are really intentional about including the educator in sort of setting up what they're looking for in student responses and give teachers control over how the AI is evaluating student thinking and giving feedback. Even with the flexibility that we give teachers there are some decisions that we've had to make around how we score things, for example, that we'll hear different perspectives from different teachers who have hold different beliefs. So really, just to make it really concrete, I was a math teacher for 10 years. We have math content in our platform, and for students to record and explain their thinking in math. That gives them a score on 0 through 4 scale of how strong their explanation was. And it also tells them whether or not they got the correct answer. And we've had responses where students give the incorrect answer, but they still give a really rich explanation. That they share all these different things about how they got there. And maybe they made like a little subtraction mistake or something at the end. And so that student might get like a 3 out of 4, but still get the wrong answer, which in my mind makes a ton of sense, right? Like there's a ton of that student's thinking to celebrate, even though they got the incorrect answer. But I've had teachers email me say, hey, I don't think students should get anything above a 2 if they got the incorrect answer. And there's like a pedagogical like choice there that we've made as a company, which we're happy to like be transparent about and be explicit about with our users. But we've made that choice to sort of inform how we're scoring that student work. And I think there are, of course, risks there with companies just making choices about how you evaluate student work if that's not transparent with educators. But so, yeah, that was a very short, but I think, again, we're trying to invite educators into that process, and we're also making some choices and trying to be transparent about those choices so that folks feel like they know how that's working and why that's working in the way it does.
Yeah, I would agree that I think transparency is a critical component of this. We have to be really transparent with our users about what is happening in the background, what choices we've made, what we're leaving up to them, and why. So I think that's one piece of it. But I also think there's something to being able to get to the place where you know how to surface the insight that the educator needs in that moment, right? And so I think if you just present someone with every choice, right, you're gonna run into decision fatigue very, very quickly. And God knows if any of us have spent time in a school, by roughly 15 minutes after the first bell, decision fatigue is starting to set in because educators are making so many choices every day. So if you present them with 100 different options for the piece of data that rises to the top, that's going to make it really hard for them to figure out what is it that I actually need in this moment. So I think that there'll have to be a level of sort of intuitive, smart driven ability to say, these are the pieces of information that I need, or these are the ones that are most significant. And I think some of that comes back to that concept of user control. Maybe as, say, a curriculum supervisor, which is a role that I've held in the past, I get to say, these are the 3 pieces of information that I want consistently pushed to educators, right? They don't have to go looking for it, right? Because they're not hunters and gatherers, but we're going to push it to them. And I think to the degree that technology can help them do that, whether it's a notification or an alert that pushes something, or the ability to put like a micro teaching resource that automatically gets pushed to a student to take away some of that manual decision making process that has to happen in the moment. At the same time, you have to still leave room for the judgment of the educator to decide, no, I actually need this piece of information. So it's this balance of having a wealth of choices, but also the ability to very easily and efficiently streamline what I need in this moment. And the smarter the tech is behind that, the easier it will be for educators, to pick up on what it is Patty's trying to do in this moment that she's teaching. This is going to be the right piece of data that's going to be valuable to her. I will push that data to her. When the machines can help to make some of those choices, or at least narrow down the options, I think it gets a lot more user friendly then.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I want to be mindful of time, so I'm going to open it up to some of the questions that we've gotten. And I was just a reminder to our audience, if there's anything else that you guys want to ask, please, do submit. I think one of the first one is around how can AI companies develop relevant tools to help students cultivate metacognition and learn how to learn, right? I think making sure that AI is becoming that effective thought partner is a very critical area. And a lot of what we talk about is like automation. How do we surface this? How do we help people make this and understand what to do next? Like, I think there's a lot of concern around that metacognition piece.
You want to go first, Patty?
Sure, I'll jump in. I'm actually going to try cue off of something you said earlier when you were talking about being able to analyze reflections and things like that when students are reflecting. I think that's a big piece of it, is we have to get into the business of surfacing student thinking, making the thinking visible to the greatest degree possible. Because when we can set up a system where students' thinking is visible, it allows educators to have the right pushes, right, to ask the right questions. If I can't see your thinking, whether that's, through oral recitation, or you're writing it, or it's coming from, say, our insights panel in Clarity, where we're looking at how students are using the different tools that are there and surfacing insights around that, that's making the thinking visible, which allows the educator to then say, okay, talk to me about how you decided to do X, or talk to me about why you made this choice, or you took this approach. Math is not my forte, John, so I'm not going to push into that. But I know that, show your work is a concept we all probably experience as students ourselves. And certainly every math teacher I know has said that at least 1 million times. And the reason is because we want to understand what the process is. It's the same reason that in Clarity, we don't want to just see the final product. We want to see how the writing took shape over time, because that then allows the educator to ask the right questions. And when they start really probing students around, I see that you asked the AI to give you an answer to this question, and then you just pasted that right in. Why did you do that? What could you have done differently? It's forcing the student to think about the choices that they made. What questions did you ask ChatGPT when you were using it for your research purposes? That becomes very revealing, and it allows us to give them feedback on not just the product, but the process and the thinking that went into it. But first, you've got to make that thinking visible. Otherwise, you don't have the opportunity to ask the right questions. So I think that's step number one.
Yeah, echoing some of those same things, same themes. I'm thinking about, if I want my students to be more metacognitively engaged, I need them, one, to make their thinking explicit. I need to ask them some key questions about that thinking. And I need them to have some agency to either make some decisions around that. Maybe it's do some revision around that. Maybe it's reflect around those questions that we're asking students. So I think it's really important as we're building these tools that we're thinking about how do we incorporate all three of those components of supporting that metacognition.
Yeah, very cool. Another question that came in is that, are there examples of recent or current research confirming evolving assessment practices? I think there's really looking for who is providing best practice models for where the future could go.
It's a great question. Patty, maybe you can speak to this more than I can. I think we've certainly drawn from a lot of historical research around what does great feedback look like, what's the role of students speaking in their learning process, how does that support student metacognition and student ownership of their learning. And so there's certainly a lot of research that we've built based off of. I don't know that we don't have the research arm to look at what's at the cusp of what folks are saying about what's coming next in the assessment space, but I'm excited to learn from you, Patty, if you've got more answers there.
Well, I didn't come with an annotated bibliography. I probably should have, but there are some voices out there where people are starting to emerge and talking about what that could look like. Phil Dawson down in Australia is one. I've followed Phil for a long time. Sometimes I agree, sometimes I don't, but I always appreciate his lens, and he brings some other voices into that conversation. But to your point, John, we're also thinking about some of the tried and true practices that we now have the technology to support. I mentioned John Hattie before. He's been doing this work on effect size to understand which interventions, which strategies have the greatest effect for a really long time. And it all applies true. And then you have the voices that are out there that have been around project-based learning and things like simulations, particularly for STEM areas. These are things that are very true. They're just more possible now with with technology. It's not necessarily that those tried and true things have changed. If you look at things like grading and assessment, you've got folks like Thomas Guskey and Douglas Reeves, who've been out there for a very long time, kind of tipping the paradigm. And those things are still true. I think that tried and true platform of what works and what kinds of changes we should be thinking about has been out there. I think people just haven't felt like it was attainable because the technology and the infrastructure to get there. So I see a lot of people drawing off of foundational work for these new principles moving forward. That having been said, I think that the pace of change is incredibly rapid right now, and we will all have a responsibility to be looking for the newest voices who come with a change. You know, we talk about what assessment might look like in 5 years, but you know what's really interesting to me, again, I have a 5-year-old, is to think about what it looks like in 20 years. Because the students who are in kindergarten today will be growing up in an AI world where it is very pervasive. It's a part of so many aspects of their life. When those students start to make their way into education and into research, I think that they're going to have a very different framework than those of us who are in that space today. That's a little bit scary if you're one of those people who's in the space today, but it's also really exciting to say, what will they bring to this picture that we can't even conceptualize right now? So I think we're all just going to have to do a lot of reading over the coming years to really keep our finger on the pulse. And continue to do the things that Jon and I both talked about today, like staying really close to teachers who are still in the field and what's happening in their classrooms, and constantly bringing that back into the work that we're doing to develop products.
I think that's funny because the next question really is like, where do you see assessments in 20 years from now? And I recognize you said, look, the magic 8 ball is incredibly difficult, and the pace at which this technology is changing, it's really hard. I think most people are hesitant to look out, even 3 months from now in many cases, let alone 20 years. With that said, maybe we could reframe it a little bit to say, the last couple minutes, what would you hope assessments look like in like 20 years from now?
Yeah. You want to go first, Jon?
Sure. I think, and Patty, you spoke to this a little bit earlier, I think assessments will be more directly embedded in that teaching and learning cycle. I think we'll see assessment that's far more personalized and accessible to every student through things like multimodal, just like capturing student thinking in different rich ways. That feedback cycle and that timeline will shorten and quicken. And I think that opens up a number of possibilities for what that could look like. I think probably the bigger question that will also influence this is what does a classroom look like 20 years from now? What do schools look like? I think there's these new school models that are coming out around, do we do a really short intensive school day, or how do we structure this differently? And that's going to have an impact on how we think about assessment too. I think those two things will be tied together.
Yeah. I hope that what we'll see is that there will be a true pivot away from single point in time measures of learning. Which is not to say that they'll go away completely, but I think there'll be a much smaller piece of the picture. I hope that we will be looking at artifacts across the teaching and learning cycle as assessment artifacts, as opposed to, did you answer this question the right way on this day and at this time? I hope that we will truly make the leap away from very literal regurgitation type assessment that is just literally what is this thing, and really push toward higher order thinking. I hope that we embrace the things that are uniquely human, things like curiosity and collaboration, judgment, synthesis, those very high level thinkings. And I hope that expands beyond what are some fairly traditional views of what learning is, to include things like how people work together and the how of a process, so much more than the what of a product. I think there is some of that today, but I think that it will expand. And I expect, and this I don't think will take 20 years, I expect to see that we will start to measure how students use these new tools, whether they know when to use a particular generative AI tool and how to use it effectively and with integrity, how to use it to supplement their learning and thinking instead of supplanting it. So those are the things I hope for. I think that last one around the tools is the one that is likely to start coming into play very rapidly.
I really appreciate both of you guys sharing aspirations and what I think is a really positive and hopeful outlook, right, for students going forward. And I think what we've seen repeatedly and what I've been hearing is, look, the potential is there, the potential to achieve measurement consistently of progress over time, and then to be able to translate that in not just progress, but student thinking over time development, and be able to translate that into instructional coherence and as well actionable insights. It's all there. And now today, it's really about how do we execute that by creating systems which have interoperability, be able to surface the information in ways that is easy for teachers to understand and use, and then to also ensure that everyone has the training and professional development to be able to understand this tremendous paradigm shift. And if we get there, then to Jon, your point, if we can change how we measure things, there's also potential to really change the actual model of schooling itself too, and to influence that. So thank you once again for joining us, and we really appreciate it. And we hope everybody else has learned as much as Claire and I have today. So
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having us.